Greetings and welcome to the channel. My name is Dr. Gyesie, transformational coach here at Inner Mileage, where we help folks transform from their trauma-based limiting self-beliefs so you can take inspired action to live resonant lives right here, right now. Today we're going to talk about the shadow work journey, confronting your inner critic to unlock your true potential. And this is really about shadow work and why shadow work is non-negotiable. So it's important to realize that there's no enemy but the one within. Therefore, when you befriend the shadow, you inherit the keys to the kingdom few dare to enter. And this is particularly apt in an era obsessed with performance, personal branding, and curated perfection. Most people avoid the true work, which is self-confrontation. And shadow work is not just a psychological exercise, it's the axis of personal evolution, because it separates the self-aware leader from the reactive follower. And every high-performance individual eventually collides with their own inner architecture. And those who refuse this reckoning either plateau, implode, or project their disowned shadows onto teams, families, and the public. The inner critic is indeed the threshold guardian, and this guardian, which is often referenced in mythological works like Joseph Campbell's or Carlos Castaneda's, and in modern psychology. And it's not an accidental nuisance, it's a built-in evolutionary mechanism forged by a biological necessity, familial conditioning, and ancestral survival intelligence. So to ascend in leadership, purpose, or spiritual development, confronting this inner architecture is a non-negotiable. So let's talk about this inner critic or this shadow self from an energetic phenomenon perspective. So this inner critic is often mischaracterized or characterized as just negative thinking. But it's actually a convergence of several forces, such as the biological, right? Research from the University of Michigan shows that negative self-talk activates the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, which floods the body with cortisol, the stress hormone, therefore preparing the body for fight or flight constantly. And trauma will do that to you. And this response was essential when you had saber-toothed tigers and human-sized snakes and so forth. But today, it catastrophizes everyday risks, public speaking, innovation, change, into this massive fear. And then you've got the psychological dimension. I'm talking about the inner critic. So Carl Jung, who I often reference, identified the shadow self as the repressed parts of the psyche. And these repressed parts of the psyche are not inherently bad, but they are deemed socially or personally unacceptable. And the inner critic often echoes early caregivers, teachers, and society. This is known in schema therapy as the punitive parent mode, this archetype, if you may. And also we know that another root of this inner critic, so-called negative self-talk, is epigenetic. It's inherited from our ancestors. So you may be a critic today thinking it's just you, but your critical voice is a voice warning of famine, oppression, persecution embedded in your family memory. It's not just you. And there's also an energetic dimension, particularly in spiritual traditions. The inner critic mirrors the threshold guardian archetype. For example, in Hermeticism, from ancient Egypt, or the Kabbalah, this voice is known as the Qliphoth, which is the shell that must be transcended to reach divine potential. And then when you consider all of this in the quantum realm, you realize that the observer effect influences matter and form and probability. In other words, your inner critic collapses potential realities into limited outcomes. So by shifting your perception, you can alter the field. Do you see? It's all about this internal locus of navigation. And what are your centers of influence that are running your default mode? Do you believe negativity more than positivity, or vice versa? So you realize that the critic is not an obstacle. It's actually a guardian of evolution. And ignoring it cements its power. However, engaging with it begins its transmutation. So what's the utility of a shadow, and why must you engage it and not resist it? Well, mainstream personal development advocates say silence that inner critic. This is both psychologically inaccurate and spiritually reckless, because the enemy you suppress becomes the tyrant you serve. So let's go into why the critic is useful. The critic is useful because it maintains stasis or homeostasis. Because the inner critic, or this inner voice or shadow self, protects you from emotional, social, and physical risks. And your task is not to eliminate it, but to negotiate with it, updating its parameters from ancient survival to modern purpose. Then when you think about neuroplasticity, there's this notion that neurons that fire together wire together. That's Hebb's law. So awareness of the inner critic interrupts your default wiring. And that creates an expansion in the brain called neuroplasticity, which rewires your thoughts and emotions and behavior. Then when you come to the spiritual physics of resistance, chaos theory teaches that small initial shifts can produce vast, non-linear results. That's the butterfly effect. Therefore, reframe the inner critic. I am not afraid, I am safe. I am not afraid, I am safe. It's the butterfly effect of consciousness. Then from the Buddhist perspective, there's this notion of the papancha mind, which refers to this mental proliferation of self-judgment. And this critic's proliferation of self-judgment can be stopped by mindful presence, sometimes with a breath or with wise attention. So you realize that with alchemy as well, the critic's voice marks where dissolution must begin. So this inner critic is not a flaw, it's a map to your next initiation and what you need to work on, what you need to follow up on. So how do you get into shadow work? Of course, you want to work with a coach like myself who's trauma-informed to help you. But I have to say that the shadow work process is not feel-good work. It isn't. It's a structured re-engineering of your conscious mind. And it may take place in this frame. And identify what we focus on is the first pillar of self-inquiry, because self-inquiry brings you to identification, where you're aware of your thoughts, your cognitive diffusion, and you're able to identify recurring themes that are in your mind consciously, unconsciously, and subconsciously. This leads to self-awareness. This is where you begin to integrate what's happening to you, where you recognize the protective intention of this inner critic. So you ask the question, what are you trying to prevent? And when you continue to inquire in this way of your inner critic, it upgrades the critic into an inner advisor because you're in dialogue. Then self-transformation and transmutation becomes possible, because when you pair compassionate witnessing or mindfulness with quantum visualization, you can turn this inner critic into a wise mentor. Again, this is the observer effect. Changing perception alters the energetic state. And then from there, you approach self-mastery or rebirth, where you are operating with a new software program, a new core belief, which is repeated through embedded and embodied affirmation, right? Spoken with affirmative declaration. This new belief shifts the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia circuits, and embodiment accelerates belief integration at the body or somatic level and at the aura or the energetic level. So in conclusion, most people unconsciously contract their lives to fit the inner critic's expectations, right? And we know that engaging with your empowered voice consistently rewires your neural network. And therefore, facing internal resistance while maintaining safety expands resilience and emotional flexibility. You see? So, those who master their inner critic transcend reactive leadership because they model response flexibility, adaptive courage, and inspired innovation. If you're watching this, you're no longer a passive seeker. You're a builder of new realities, and your inner critic was never designed to be your master. In fact, it was designed to be met, understood, updated, and integrated. And shadow work is the spiritual physics of authorship. If any of this resonated with you, type transform in the comment section if it can be of help. Let us know what your experience with this has been. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're notified of upcoming videos. Like, share, subscribe. And remember, there's absolutely no one like you, and your shadow can become your servant. Peace.